Okay, I think we're ready. So I hope Evan's talk woke everyone up. It certainly woke me up. Really excited to hear about all the future of Vite and Vite Plus. So I'm going to be talking about the Vite Environment API, and I'm also going to be talking about the Cloudflare Vite plugin and how we built it on top of the Vite Environment API. So I'm James. I'm an engineer at Cloudflare. I work on developer tooling primarily, and over the last year, that's been a lot of work on Cloudflare's support for Vite and the Vite plugin. So I'll be talking about what it is, what you can build with it, and giving you a little insight into how it works. But I'll also be talking about the Cloudflare, about the Vite Environment API more generally, and some of the implications of it. So before coming to this conference, who had heard of the Environment API before? Okay, good. So, and who would say they had like a good understanding of what it is? Okay, so far fewer hands. So I feel like it's slightly sort of mysterious at the moment. It's kind of it's been experimental for a while, and this kind of understandable, I think, because a lot of it's aimed more to people who actually develop the tools rather than end users, and it actually is a unified solution for a lot of different problems. So it's quite hard to sort of just say in one sentence sort of what it is. I think to understand what it is, though, and sort of where it came from, we'll just look very briefly at the history of Vite. So we got a really good insight into the early days yesterday in a documentary. But just to summarize, focused on client-side applications, developers fell in love with fast feedback loop and ease of use. And originally for Vue, but it soon expanded to support a broad range of front-end frameworks, including Vue, React, Svelte, and many others. And it quickly became the tool of choice for building single-page applications. And I'm sure for a lot of the people here, possibly the majority, that was how you got into using Vite in the first place. Who still enjoys building single-page applications? I do. Okay, but then the next phase is this sort of rise of the meta frameworks. So you get a new generation of full-stack frameworks that started to emerge, including SvelteKit, Nuxt, Astro, Remix, and others. And they wanted to use Vite for its amazing client-side developer experience, but they also needed to support other server-side features, such as SSR and other features in those lines. So for anyone who was at Rich Harris's talk yesterday, sort of alluded to the fact that SvelteKit was the first framework to start pushing this, and actually was the driver for some of these new APIs in Vite that enabled this to start with. So what did this look like initially? So initial SSR support in dev was primarily SSR load module, which was an API for the dev server to load modules for SSR. And it had built-in caching. It worked very nicely. And then what a framework could do is it could add a middleware to handle requests with server-side code. So in the example here, SSR load module would load the modules to bring in the framework and user code. And then this is simplified, obviously, but there'd be some sort of handling function that then can actually handle the request and return a response. And something else is, because this is running in the dev server, it's running in the same node process as the dev server itself. And really, this was an additive feature and a fundamental change to Vite. It didn't change anything else about Vite at all. It just meant that alongside Vite's internal middleware, all the client-side handling would work as normal, but then you could hit this middleware provided by a framework, and it could server render code. And then at build time, you had to run the build command twice. So you had to run build once for the client environment, and then you had to run it again with the SSR flag for the SSR environment. And because of this and other limitations, frameworks typically at this time were using their own CLIs to encapsulate behavior. So the framework as a plugin model kind of lacked some key features at this time. And it was really interesting in Evan's talk just now to hear him talk about the framework as a plugin model and how it's going to develop even more in the future with Vite+. So the environment API, how does it solve some of these problems? Well, first of all, server environments become first-class citizens. So client and SSR become the two default environments. So if you think back to that previous slide, we had the client build step, we had the server build step, and those are the two environments that now become the default. But you can also add additional environments as needed to model the production behavior of modern full stack applications. So some examples to come to mind, you might think of an application that has an edge middleware that sits separately to the server-side rendering. And more recently, there's React Server Components, and the new Vite plugin for RSC also builds on the Environment API and uses these same features. So I think there's going to be a lot more exploration in this space as well about what it could mean to have additional environments, how that can reflect more closely how we actually deploy applications in production. It's really exciting. And each environment is now cleanly separated with its own module graph, plugin hooks, etc. So really, there's sort of more parity now between what was happening in the client before and what can now happen on the server side. And additional features come with that too. So things like hot module replacement can now also be used on the server. Very cool. And then on the build side, there's new APIs to orchestrate the build. So there's no need to run the build command twice anymore, because now multiple environments can be built with a single command. And frameworks can control the build order and add additional steps as needed. So they might want to do some additional handling around those steps, and they can do that with these new APIs. But there's something else that the Environment API brings that's really exciting. So all this stuff already is a lot, right? But there's something else, and that is that server environments are now decoupled from the Vite dev server. So that means they can run in the same Node.js process, just like they did before. They can run in a separate process, or they can even run in a separate JavaScript runtime. And that's what sort of brings us on to Cloudflare Workers and why this was a really interesting idea for us in terms of how we can improve developer tooling. So who has heard of Cloudflare Workers? Okay, good. And who has ever deployed a Cloudflare Worker? Wow, quite a lot of you. That's really encouraging to see. Nice. So fundamentally, Cloudflare Workers is a platform for running applications on Cloudflare's global network. And workers themselves, they sit at the center of a platform that has all the features you need to build modern applications. So there's fundamental primitives like KV, which is a key value store, D1, which is a relational database, R2 for blob storage. And then there's lots of other products that have a sort of Cloudflare edge to them. So things like durable objects is something quite unique for stateful compute. We have workflows, we have containers, but in a probably a little different to how you've imagined containers before, AI, queues, all sorts of things. I encourage you to have a look at all the parts of the developer platform that are available and all the things you can use them to build. But when it comes to actually writing a worker, so typically it's a JavaScript module. And at its simplest, it can be a default export with a fetch handler, and that fetch handler receives a web request, and it returns a web response. So it builds it's a simple API. It builds on web APIs. That was kind of the principle behind it. And then to access all those services that I just talked about, we have what's known as bindings. So you can access them via this env argument, which gets passed into the handler. So in this very simple example, we've got a KV binding that we can access to get a value from our KV store, and then we can return that in a response. But the same simple approach for connecting to bindings is used for all the services I mentioned. And then there's another more recent way you can access bindings as well, which is actually by importing env directly from Cloudflare workers. So this is really nice, especially if you're working with full stack frameworks or larger applications, because you no longer have to drill that env down through lots of layers to get it to where you actually use it in your application code. You can just import it as needed. So this code runs in workerd, which is a Cloudflare specific JavaScript runtime. Okay, it's not Node.js. And this has a lot of advantages for your deployed applications because it's designed for Cloudflare's infrastructure and it integrates with all of Cloudflare's services seamlessly. But it also has previously had disadvantages for the development experience that we've been able to offer. And that's really because until recently, if you were using a tool like Vite, your server-side code would be running in Node.js. Okay, so in development, you'll be running in Node, you come to deploy your app, and it gets deployed and it runs in a different runtime. And this can lead to sort of subtle differences, which can be frustrating, but it also restricts the ease of which you can interact with some of the other features of Cloudflare's runtime. But this all changes now with the Environment API and the Cloudflare Vite plugin. It's now possible to run your server-side code directly in the worker's runtime in development inside Vite. And this gives you full access to all of those Cloudflare platform-specific features while retaining all the benefits to things we love about using Vite. Fast feedback loop, all those things we've talked about and that you've seen over the other talks. So what does this enable you to build? Okay, the interesting part. So I'll go through a few different possibilities, starting at one side of the coin, which is kind of server-side only applications. So here we got a Vite config, and all you need to do is you import the Cloudflare plugin, you add it to your plugins array, and then we also add a worker config file. So this is just a standard configuration format for Cloudflare workers. And you can see the main field here points to the entry module for our worker. So anyway, if you've deployed, and a lot of you, it seems, have deployed workers before, you probably use Wrangler. There are a few reasons why you might want to reach for this instead. You don't have to, but if you wanted to, one is you immediately have access to Vite's rich ecosystem of plugins. So you can integrate it with other things, other parts of the ecosystem that you might already be using. And another is that you have a lot more flexibility to configure the build output. So you can hook into all of rollup and soon roll down features to configure that as you like. And then a further one is you have that server-side hot module replacement, which means as your application gets bigger, your worker code grows, then the updates can stay fast. So the next, the other side of the coin is sort of client-side applications, so front-end only. This doesn't really utilize the Environment API in the same way, but because you've got the Cloudflare plugin there, you get the Cloudflare-specific asset handling, things behaving in dev just as they'll work when you deploy your application. So I've just got a front-end React app here, but you can see in my worker config file, I've defined some things for the assets configuration. I've got the not found handling set to single page application. I set the HTML handling to auto trailing slash. And then this means that that behavior is exactly the same. It gets written into configuration when you actually come to deploy your app, and you don't have to configure and figure out that stuff separately. So yeah, you can also just run Vite build followed by Wrangler deploy, and it just deploys it to Cloudflare. Very, very easy. But where it gets more interesting is when you bring these two sides together, right? So we've got our client-side app here, and we want to have a worker as our backend API. So in this case, we just add the main field back in, point it to our entry module for our worker, and now we've got an SPA on the front end, and we've got a backend API that's running in a worker, and they get seamlessly integrated in development. So you just run Vite dev, and it's going to run both environments together for a fully integrated development experience. So some examples of why you might want to do this. So if you're using, for example, a library on the back end like TRPC or Hono, and you've got that really nice type safety across front end and back end, then this allows you to run it all inside Vite. And then you can build and deploy the client and server parts of your app together. And then the next bit would be full stack applications using full stack frameworks. So we currently support React Router, Redwood SDK, and most recently TanStack Start. There's more frameworks to come. And here you can see we've got an example configuration where we've got our React plugin, we've got now our framework plugin, which in this case is TanStack Start, and then we've got our Cloudflare plugin. And there's one more change to configuration I'm going to make, which is to set the Vite environment of the Cloudflare plugin to SSR. And what that's doing is it's assigning the worker to the SSR environment. And that means that the configuration for that environment set by the framework and set by the Cloudflare plugin get merged, and they can kind of collaborate on that. But what's kind of, sorry, I'll just go, the worker config file as well, I'll just point out one thing about that, which is that the main field, we've sort of gone for a very low boilerplate approach here as a way to get started, is that you can actually, in your main field, rather than putting your own entry file, you can even now put a export from the framework in this case. But there's no direct coupling here between the framework and platform plugins. And that's what I think kind of makes this quite interesting compared to the kind of adaptory kind of things we've seen with frameworks before. So TanStack Start doesn't have to contain any Cloudflare specific code. And the Cloudflare plugin doesn't have to know specifically that it's working with TanStack Start and not React Router or some other framework. So instead, they're working together and they're utilizing the Environment API to work together through a shared contract with Vite. So the platform is providing the entry file, and this file delegates the request to the framework in this case. But that will become a bit clearer if I actually provide a custom worker now rather than using that export directly from the framework. So we're back at sort of where we were looking a few minutes ago. We've got a simple worker. It's returning a response that just says, hello world, okay? But now, if you import that handler from the framework, TanStack Start here, then you can see inside our fetch handler, we can essentially delegate the request to the framework's own handling. So we're taking the request that's passed in, and we're passing it to the fetch method of the framework's handler. So like I say, you don't have to do this, but what this gives you is a lot of control, because it means you can actually add additional behavior around the framework, right? You might decide to add your own logging in front or some instrumentation. And you can even, in Cloudflare's case, you can add additional exports on this module. For example, if you're using a durable object or using a workflow, then having control over your worker entry file gives you a lot more options about how you configure those things. And dev and build function very much in the same way. They're both using this same file as their entry. So in dev, basically, the platform provides the middleware to handle the request, and that request is going to be handled essentially by this file that we're looking at. And then at build time, the platform provides the build entry file. And the framework can provide defaults for both of those things, right? So it doesn't have to require on there being a plugin like the Cloudflare plugin present, because it can provide default behavior for Node out of the box. And then when this other plugin is present, it can override those with its own values. So just want to give a bit more insight into sort of how this all ties together. So you can see on the left of the screen, we've got the Vite dev server, which is still running in Node. And then at the top, we've got the browser, the client environment, the browser runtime. And this kind of shows you how this model of a decoupled runtime was already the case, right, for the client environment, because the browser is a separate JavaScript runtime. We're essentially extending that idea so that server environments are also decoupled in the same way. So a request will come from the browser, it'll go to the Vite dev server, and then the Vite dev server can forward on that request to the environment, which could be a worker environment in this case, and then that will return a response, goes back to the Vite dev server, which returns it back to the browser. And then in between, you have all this machinery which Vite provides for dynamically loading modules and resolving, transforming, all the stuff we've seen about in other talks, which gives Vite such great flexibility. But this also kind of closely replicates in dev what is happening in production, because you can kind of think of the dev server as being like the infrastructure of the internet, and the browser makes a request to it, and that request is going to then make its way to wherever your code actually runs. And then the stuff in the middle, rather than being dynamically provided, like it is in dev time, it'll be the actual assets that you've output at build time, statically provided. So you might wonder, why don't all frameworks work with this straight away? Why isn't adoptable by everyone immediately? And it's really because if we think back to the initial support we looked at earlier, it was an assumption essentially that the SSR handling was happening in the same process as the Vite dev server. And that's an assumption that meant people did things that aren't possible in this paradigm. But what we've found, especially working alongside frameworks and the feedback I think the Vite team have got also with the Environment API, is that moving to this model actually really improves your framework code for development time, because it brings it closer to production. Because a lot of frameworks, they typically have very different handling for how things work in development and how things work with the actual build time. And if you can bring those things closer together so that actually at dev time it doesn't rely on being in the same process as the dev server, then there's the possibility for more of that code to be shared, which is really nice. Okay, I'm just going to give you a little quick window into how accessing those bindings might look with inside a full stack framework. So I'm just using TanStack Start as an example because it's the one freshest in my mind, is what we've worked together on most recently. But this applies to other frameworks as well. But here you can see we've got a root definition, and then we've got a server function here. And that server function will always run on the server. So it's always going to run in a worker in this case, and therefore it can access bindings directly. And then our component loads data via the loader, which calls the server function, and then we can render the value. So because we're running inside the worker's runtime, you can import things directly from Cloudflare workers, and they will just work. as long as you're running them on the server side. So before I wrap up, I just want to sort of look back at this plugins array, because I think it's quite interesting, the implications of this. So we've talked about the framework as a plugin model. We've talked about how it had some shortcomings, how they've sort of been overcome by the Environment API, and we've seen how there's a real future for that in terms of how more features are coming with Vite Plus for frameworks to actually build out even more capabilities through this plugin model. And then what the Environment API also enables is this kind of platform as a plugin model where you're adding server-side behavior that works alongside your framework and handles your server-side code. And I think this is interesting to think about and kind of to figure out what the direction is here as well with the community, because frameworks now don't need to know everything about the platform they're deploying to, right? They don't have to keep up to date with every feature that's added to a platform and expose all these features through their own primitives, because the framework can also just be considered part of a larger application and interface seamlessly with those features. And with environments, that can even be the framework is operating in one part and there's some other stuff going on elsewhere that it communicate with. So I think there's a lot of potential in this area. I'm really excited to see how it goes. And I know other people are starting to explore stuff here as well. Nitro are also working on a Vite plugin. And I think this principle could apply to platform providers. It's also just apply to anything where you really want to wrap your framework in some handling in development so that you can get a more of a sense how it works when it will actually be deployed. That could be, for example, something like modeling how it'll run on AWS Lambda or in Fastify or Dino or any of these things, so that you can get access to the features of that and wrap your framework inside its own handling. So I want to say a big thank you to the Vite team who've worked tirelessly on this Environment API and really communicated with framework authors, with platform authors like us at Cloudflare, and with the community. And I think that this is looking to go stable relatively soon. So if you haven't tried it out, now's the time. If you're a framework author or someone who's working on some tools where you could utilize the actual APIs directly, feedback's really important. I think, as someone said in the Q&A yesterday, it's annoying when stuff goes stable and then people start complaining about it. So RC experimental phase is the time to get that feedback in. Thank you all for listening. Go and try it out. Go try out the Cloudflare Vite plugin, add it to your SBA, try adding a backend, try out the frameworks we support, see how you get on. Come and chat to me about any of this. Love to talk about it. And then if you want to learn more about our plugin, I've linked to the docs there, but I've also linked to the Environment API docs for Vite, for if you're interested to dig into a bit more about how the actual underlying APIs work and find out more. Thank you.